Welcome to the channel, The Revenge of Slaves. 7 winters had transformed Caleb into something more unyielding than the granite ridge that served as his home. The scent of dried blood and aged pine clung to him, and his conversations were limited to his mules. In the valley below, the townspeople referred to him as a ghost, giving him a wide berth until a shattered wagon axle brought a perspiring, robust widow and her outspoken daughter to his doorstep. He had his rifle trained on them. Then the child pointed at his disfigured, scarred visage and uttered a declaration that rattled him to his core. Loose stones shifted beneath Caleb's worn leather footwear. Each footfall kicked up tiny clouds of chalky dust that carried the metallic taste of old coins. A freshly killed deer was draped across his broad shoulder, its warmth bleeding through his canvas jacket, while its blood marked a slow, dark rhythm onto the forest floor. The woodland up here typically maintained an oppressive quiet, except for the wind dragging itself through the evergreen boughs. But today an abrasive noise grated against his senses. Wood groaning against metal, a sharp repeated impact, a curse muttered in a weary, resonant alto. Caleb deposited the deer on the salt-stained planks of his porch. He bypassed his hunting knife. Instead, he retrieved the Winchester from its position beside the doorframe, his frost-bitten thumb checking the mechanism with practiced familiarity. He circled his clearing, moving with surprising stealth for his large frame. Near the eroded creek bed, a wagon sat tilted at an alarming angle. Its rear axle had fractured cleanly, exposing a jagged shard of hickory protruding into the mire. Standing beside it was a woman who occupied more space than anyone Caleb had encountered in years. She was broad and substantial, her frame a substantial mass that strained against the confines of a sweat-darkened gray wool dress. Dirt streaked her forearms. Her face glowed dark red, perspiration plastering strands of mousy brown hair to her brow. She gripped a thick wooden lever positioned under the wagon bed, applying her entire considerable weight to elevate the rear section. The muscles in her neck stood out prominently as she emitted a deep guttural sound of raw effort. The wagon responded only by groaning and sinking further into the sludge. Perched on a flat rock 10 yards distant, swinging scuffed boots, sat a young girl around 6 years old, thin as a fence rail, clutching a handful of withered dandelion weeds. "Push harder, Mama," the girl stated, completely unconcerned. "I am pushing." "Lily," the woman retorted sharply, her voice carrying a fatigue so profound Caleb could sense it in his own bones. "It's heavy and immovable." Caleb emerged from behind the tree line, the Winchester held visibly but casually across his chest. He remained silent, standing there with the mingled scents of copper and pine pitch surrounding him, his features partially concealed by a tangled, graying beard and the brutal scar that extended from his left temple to his collarbone, a permanent reminder from a grisly encounter that had claimed his smile and left eyes 7 winters past. The woman Martha noticed him first. She didn't shriek or recoil. She simply ceased pushing the lever, allowing the wagon to drop back with a dull impact, and wiped her soiled hands on her apron. Her chest heaved as she drew in deep, ragged breaths of the thin mountain atmosphere. She examined the rifle, then his face, her dark eyes displaying no fear whatsoever, only a profound, wary annoyance. "Are you going to shoot us, or will you assist me with this?" she inquired. Her voice lacked any quiver. It sounded like weathered leather. Caleb experienced an unfamiliar twitch in his jaw. Women typically screamed or fled, or at minimum averted their gaze from the ruined landscape of his face. "This is private land," he rasped, his vocal cords scraping together like sandpaper after years of disuse. "Well, the axle didn't request the proper deed before it broke." Martha fired back, planting her thick, dimpled hands on her broad hips. She carried the scents of lye soap, old sweat, and stale biscuit flour. "We were heading for the lower pass. A mudslide diverted us up here. Now we're stranded." Lily slid off the rock. She marched directly toward Caleb, completely disregarding the rifle barrel. She tilted her head, squinting up at his face, her nose wrinkled. "You smell like dead creatures, mister, and your face is all damaged. You appear angry." Caleb narrowed his remaining eye. "I am angry." Lily glanced back at her mother, who was massaging the small of her broad back with a grimace. Then the girl looked back at the intimidating scarred figure. "My mama can remedy that?" Caleb snorted, a harsh, discordant sound. "Remedy what? My face or the wagon?" "Both," Lily stated matter-of-factly. "She excels at repairing broken items." She fixed my boots with adhesive. She can probably glue your face too. And she can make you stop looking so unfriendly. She bakes exceptional cobbler. Cobbler improves everyone's disposition. Martha closed her eyes, releasing a prolonged, slow exhale that disturbed the dirt on her lips. Lily, hush. The man doesn't desire cobbler. He wants us removed from his land. She opened her eyes and met Caleb's gaze directly. I lack funds to compensate you for assistance. I possess half a sack of coffee, some salted pork, and 2 capable hands. You help me construct a brace for this axle, and I'll repair every garment in that cabin. Clearly you require it. Caleb studied her intently. She displayed no vanity. Her stomach pressed round and heavy against her apron. Her arms were thick with both flesh and muscle, and her plain face was framed by a double chin she held high with stubborn pride. She wasn't soliciting charity. She was proposing an exchange. He glanced at the sky. Gray clouds were darkening the horizon. It would freeze tonight. Bring the child, Caleb grunted, turning his back on them. Chabin is up the hill. Inside the cabin was a testament to functional desolation. The air hung heavy with the dense odors of rendered tallow, damp wool, and wood smoke. Dust particles drifted lazily in the weak light penetrating the single grimy window. A stone hearth dominated one wall, currently containing nothing but cold gray ash. When Martha stepped through the doorway, the modest space seemed to contract. She occupied room, not just physically, but with the sheer force of her presence. She didn't linger near the entrance like a hesitant visitor. She proceeded directly to the center of the room, her heavy footsteps causing the floorboards to protest, and began unfastening her mud-caked boots. Caleb observed from the corner, leaning the Winchester against the wall. He felt confined. He resented it. For 7 years, the only breathing he'd heard in this room was his own. Now the cabin filled with sounds of her, the heavy rhythmic intake of breath as she bent over her boots, the rustle of her thick petticoats, the soft fleshy impact of her bare feet on the cold wood. It's freezing in here, Martha stated. Not a complaint, merely an observation. She examined the hearth. You have wood out back, Caleb mumbled, pulling off his gloves. His knuckles were raw, scraped from skinning the deer. Martha pointed a thick finger at Lily. Sit on that cot and don't touch anything sharp. She turned to Caleb. Show me the wood. He wanted to instruct her to sit down, that he would handle it, but the words failed to emerge. He simply nodded and opened the rear door. Martha followed him to the woodshed. She didn't wait for him to load her. She began stacking split logs into the crook of her substantial arm. She piled them high, resting the rough bark against the soft, heavy swell of her chest. Caleb observed a splinter catch the fabric of her dress, but she simply yanked the log upward, tearing the cloth without hesitation. Back inside, she arranged the kindling with efficient, practiced movements. Within minutes, a fire was crackling, driving the damp chill from the corners. You mention a deer, Martha said, rising and dusting off her hands. Sweat glistened in the deep crease of her neck. Bring the haunches inside. I'll prepare a stew. Do you have onions, potatoes? Caleb found himself complying. He carried the heavy cuts of meat inside, depositing them on the stained wooden table. Martha rolled up her sleeves, exposing arms that were thick, pale, and remarkably strong. She located his cast iron and Dutch oven, both coated in dust and rancid grease. She frowned at them, grabbed a handful of sand from a bucket near the door, and vigorously scrubbed the iron surface before rinsing it with water from his canteen. He settled on a stool in the corner and watched her work. Her movements weren't graceful. They were heavy, deliberate, and economical. She chopped the meat with his hunting knife, shifting her weight from side to side, her breathing serving as a metronome in the quiet cabin. The aroma of searing meat and fat began to mask the scent of old tallow. Lily sat on the bed, swinging her legs, humming a tuneless melody. She stopped and pointed at Caleb's face again. Does it hurt? Caleb stiffened. He typically turned his scarred side away from people, concealing himself in shadows. No, it looks tight. Lily observed, hopping off the bed and approaching. Like when Mama burns the edges of the bread, Martha warned, her back still turned as she stirred the pot. Leave the man alone. He has enough concerns without you prodding at him. Just asking. Lily muttered. Retreating to the cot, Martha turned around, wiping her brow with the back of her wrist. She looked at Caleb, truly taking in the jagged red and white lines that pulled his skin taut across his cheekbone, the milky deadness of his left eye. She didn't flinch. Her gaze was analytical, as if inspecting a slightly bruised apple at market. "It's an unpleasant scar," she stated bluntly, "but it appears clean. Bears typically leave infection behind." Caleb blinked. No one discussed it. They stared or looked away, but they never simply acknowledged it as fact. "Cauterized it myself," he found himself saying. The memory of the red, hot iron knife making his stomach turn kept the infection out. Martha nodded slowly. "Takes a resilient kind of man to burn his own face to survive. A stubborn one." She turned back to the stew. "Stubbornness is useful. Stubbornness gets wagons repaired." Caleb sat in the ensuing silence, listening to the fat pop in the cast iron. His chest felt oddly constricted, not from anger, but from a sudden sharp absence of it. She hadn't pitied him. She hadn't recoiled. She had simply acknowledged the ugliness and moved on to dinner. Morning broke the color of bruised iron. Frost had settled overnight, coating the pine needles in stiff white armor. Inside the cabin, Caleb awoke to a sound he hadn't heard in nearly a decade, a woman snoring. It was a deep, rumbling vibration that seemed to emanate from the floorboards themselves. He rolled over on his pallet near the hearth and looked toward his own bed. Martha was sprawled across it, occupying nearly every inch of the mattress. She lay on her back, mouth slightly open, one thick arm thrown protectively over Lily, who was curled into her mother's massive side like a barn cat seeking warmth. Caleb watched them for a long moment. He should have been furious. This was his sanctuary, his retreat from a world that regarded him with revulsion. Yet observing the sheer, unapologetic bulk of the woman occupying his bed, he felt a strange anchoring sensation. She was as real and immovable as the mountain itself. He rose quietly, pulling on his boots. His joints protested in the cold. He stoked the fire, placed a pot of coffee on the hook, and stepped outside to inspect the wagon damage in daylight. The axle was ruined beyond simple repair. It would require a heavy iron sleeve forged to bind the broken pieces together, bolted securely. He maintained a small smithy setup in the shed, an anvil and bellows forge he used for mule shoes and tool repairs. It would consume all day, possibly two, to hammer out a piece of iron thick enough to support the weight of that wagon and the woman who drove it. An hour later, the sharp ring of Caleb's hammer against the anvil echoed through the clearing. He struck the glowing red iron with measured, brutal force, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead despite the freezing air. Sparks showered his leather apron, carrying the scent of ozone and burning dust. "You're hitting it crooked." Caleb paused, mid-swing, the heavy hammer hovering above the anvil. He looked over his shoulder. Martha stood in the doorway of the shed, holding a mug of this terrible, bitter coffee, bundled in a threadbare shawl that struggled to cover her wide shoulders. Caleb lowered the hammer, his jaw tightening. "I know what I'm doing." "Didn't say you didn't," she replied, stepping into the shed. She moved close, bringing with her that smell of lye soap and the faint, sweet scent of dried apples she had discovered in his pantry. She pointed a thick finger at the glowing iron. "But your left side is weaker. You're favoring your right arm, drawing the metal thin on the far edge. The sleeve will warp when it cools." Caleb stared at her. And how would a dressmaker know about forging iron? Martha took a slow sip of the scalding coffee, unflinching. "My husband was a blacksmith in St. Louis before his heart gave out. I pumped the bellows for him for 12 years. I recognize when hot iron is being mishandled." She set her mug down on a dusty crate. Without seeking permission, she walked to the bellows and grasped the wooden handle with both hands. "Heat it back up," she ordered. "I'll work the bellows. You focus on striking evenly." Caleb hesitated. His instinct was to snap at her, to tell her to return to the cabin and sew his shirts as promised. But the iron was cooling, turning a dull, useless gray. He thrust the metal back into the coals. Martha threw her weight into the bellows. It was demanding labor, requiring rhythm and force. She didn't use just her arms. She employed her entire body, leaning her substantial frame back and forth, driving air into the forge. The fire roared to life, transforming from orange to a blinding, furious white. Caleb watched her from the corner of his good eye. She was sweating again, dark patches blooming under her arms and down her back. She didn't complain. She simply worked, her heavy breathing falling into synchronized rhythm with the roar of the flames. There was a raw, undeniable power in her bulk. She wasn't fragile. She wouldn't break under pressure. "Draw it out," she yelled over the noise of the flames. Caleb extracted the white hot iron and positioned it on the anvil. He brought the hammer down. "Clan even!" she shouted. He adjusted his grip, forcing his left arm to absorb more of the shock. Clang, the metal flattened, spreading beautifully beneath the blows. They fell into a brutal, sweaty rhythm. Strike, turn, strike, heat, pump, breathe. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the iron sleeve was shaped, cooling in a bucket of dirty water with a violent hiss of steam. Caleb dropped the hammer, his chest heaving, muscles trembling from exertion. He wiped his face with a filthy rag, accidentally dragging it across his scarred cheek. He winced. Martha released the bellows, looking exhausted, her face flushed a deep mottled purple, her hair completely undone and clinging to her damp neck. She leaned heavily against the wooden frame of the shed, catching her breath. She examined the cooling iron, then Caleb. "Better," she breathed, her voice raspy. "Yeah," Caleb managed to say. He looked at her hands, blistered from the rough wood of the bellows handle. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to fetch her cold water for her hands, a gesture of care he hadn't offered another human being in nearly a decade. Before he could move, she pushed herself off the wall, waddling slightly as her tired legs supported her weight. "I'm going to make biscuits. Do you want some?" "Yeah," he said again, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. She nodded, walking back toward the cabin. Caleb stood in the dim shed, surrounded by the smells of hot iron and sweat, listening to the heavy, solid thud of her footsteps on the dirt. For the first time in 7 years, the silence of the mountain didn't feel like relief. It felt empty. The iron sleeve weighed 40 pounds. Caleb carried it down the slope toward the creek bed, the metal still holding faint residual warmth from the forge. The afternoon sun had surrendered early behind a bank of bruised heavy clouds, and the wind was intensifying, biting through his canvas coat. Martha followed, carrying the heavy wooden lever and a canvas sack of iron bolts clanking against her hip. She had tied twine around her waist to hike up the hem of her ruined dress, revealing thick calves wrapped in gray wool stockings. She didn't complain about the steep incline or the slick frozen mud that grabbed at their boots. They reached the tilted wagon, the broken hickory axle jutting out like a compound fracture. "I'll have to get underneath to align the splintered ends." Caleb grunted, dropping the iron sleeve into the weeds. "You'll need to work the lever from the outside. When I yell you heave the bed up, I'll slide the sleeve over the brake." Martha dropped the sack of bolts. She looked at the clearance beneath the wagon bed, then at the thick, icy mud. She didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees with a heavy thud, the mud immediately soaking through her wool skirt. "I'm getting under," she said, her voice flat. "You're strong, but you lack the leverage to push that broken beam back into socket with one bad shoulder." "I do. You handle the iron. It's a two-person job." Caleb opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer stubborn set of her jaw stopped him. She was right. The angle was terrible. He watched as she shimmied her massive frame underneath the tilted wagon bed, her back pressing against the cold, dripping floorboards. Her boots digging into the muck, she wedged her thick shoulder against the broken wooden housing. Caleb crawled in beside her. The space was claustrophobic, smelling of rotting leaves, wet rot, and the sharp, sour tang of horse urine from the trail. It also smelled of her. Close up, the lye soap was gone, replaced by the honest, pungent scent of a woman who had been sweating over a forge. They were shoulder to shoulder, pressed together by the narrow clearance. Caleb could feel the solid, unyielding heat radiating from her bulk. "Ready." Martha grunted. Her face was inches from his, smeared with mud, her breathing already loud in the confined space. "On 3, Caleb said. He gripped the iron sleeve, his muscles coiling.
1, 2, 3.
Martha roared, a deep guttural sound of pure physical exertion. She drove her legs into the mud, using her back and shoulders to push the heavy oak undercarriage upward. The wagon groaned in protest. Wood cracked. "Push!" Caleb barked, fighting to align the jagged ends of the axle. Martha's face turned crimson. The veins in her thick neck bulged against her collar. She didn't stop pushing. She held the immense weight, her body acting as a living, breathing jack while Caleb shoved the heavy iron sleeve over the brake. It caught biting into the wood. "Down," he said. She let the weight settle, collapsing back into the mud with a massive exhale. Her chest heaved. Caleb reached across her, his chest brushing against her heavy breasts to grab the bolts. He didn't look at her face. He focused on the iron. He threaded the first bolt through the pre-drilled hole. his frostbitten thumb fumbling with the nut. "Let me," Martha said. Her thick fingers, calloused and surprisingly deft, brushed his away. She spun the nut onto the thread, her knuckles scraping against the rough iron. Caleb took his wrench and tightened it down. Metal screamed against wood. They worked in silence for the next 20 minutes, passing bolts, holding the wrench, locking the broken bone of the wagon into a rigid iron cast. Every time he moved, he brushed against her. The cold mud was seeping into his own clothes, chilling him to the bone, but the side of his body pressed against Martha was burning up. "That's it," Caleb said finally. He threw the wrench into the weeds. They crawled out from under the wagon, thoroughly coated in freezing mud. Martha stood up slowly, pressing a hand to her lower back. She looked at the axle. Straight, ugly, heavy, and mismatched, but undeniably solid. Caleb walked to the front of the wagon and kicked away the wheel chocks. The wagon settled onto the repaired axle with a heavy creak, but it held. It didn't sag. "It'll hold to the next town," Caleb said, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "Maybe all the way to California if you drive slow." Martha wiped a streak of mud from her forehead, succeeding only in smearing it further. She looked at the fix, then at Caleb. "Good work," she said simply. A sharp clicking sound made Caleb turn. Up by the tree line near the small rope coral, Lily was standing dangerously close to Barnaby. Barnaby was a mean 15 hand-packed mule who had once bitten 2 fingers off a prospector in Denver. Caleb took a quick step forward, his heart seizing. "Hey, kid, get away from him. He bites." Lily didn't move. She held her small hand flat, a shriveled dried apple resting on her palm. Barnaby, ears pinned flat to his skull, stretched his large, blocky head over the rope. He sniffed the apple, snorted a spray of snot onto Lily's sleeve, and then gently, delicately lifted the apple from her hand with his velvety lips, just hungry. Lily yelled back, turned to look at Caleb. "He likes the apples. You don't give him enough treats." Caleb stared. Barnaby was chewing placidly, his eyes half closed. Martha walked up beside Caleb, her heavy footsteps crunching on the freezing ground. "She's got away with ugly, ill-tempered things." Martha noted, her voice dry. She glanced sideways at Caleb's ruined face. "Finds the sweet spot in them, I suppose." Caleb felt a strange tight pull in his chest. He looked at the repaired wagon. The job was done. By all rights, they should pack up and leave at first light. That was the deal. A hard, freezing pellet of ice struck Caleb's cheek, then another. He looked up. The sky had turned a solid, bruised purple. The wind howled through the pines, dropping the temperature 10 degrees in a matter of minutes. Sleet began to fall fast and sharp. "Weather's turning," Caleb said, raising his voice over the wind. "I have eyes." Martha replied, wrapping her thin shawl tighter around her broad shoulders. She called out to Lily, "Get inside Bird now." They hurried back up the slope. By the time they reached the cabin door, the sleet had transformed into thick, heavy flakes of snow driven completely sideways by the gale, fell like a heavy iron lid. Outside, the blizzard screamed, slamming against the logs with enough force to rattle the clay chinking. Inside, the heat from the hearth fought a losing battle against the drafts. Martha sat at the small wooden table, directly under the glow of the single kerosene lantern. True to her word, she was working. A pile of Caleb's clothes sat beside her, shirts with torn sleeves, pants with blown out knees, wool socks eaten by moths. She held a heavy bone needle, threading it with thick wax cord. She didn't use a thimble. She pushed the needle through the heavy canvas of his winter coat with the sheer brute strength of her thumb, the skin there thick and calloused, a snick, pull. The rhythm was steady, a quiet counterpoint to the roaring wind. Caleb sat on his pallet by the fire, whittling a piece of soft pine with his knife. He wasn't making anything in particular, just shaving wood into curly ribbons to keep his hands busy. But his good eye kept drifting to the table. It felt intrusive, seeing her handle his clothes, the garments that smelled of his sweat, his isolation, his grim survival, felt more exposing than standing naked in the snow. "Your stitching is a sin against God," Martha said suddenly, not looking up from his coat. She picked at a clumsy, bunched-up seam on the shoulder where Caleb tried to fix a tear with fishing line. "Looks like a blind drunkard did it with a rusty nail." "It holds," Caleb muttered defensively, shaving a long strip of pine. "A rock holds a door open. Doesn't make it a hinge." She snipped the thread, taking her small iron scissors and ruthlessly cutting his crude stitches. She pulled the torn edges of the canvas together, smoothing them flat over her wide, fleshy knee. Fabric needs to breathe. You pull it too tight, it just tears somewhere else when you move. She fell silent again, her hands working fast. Lily was asleep on the cot, buried under 3 heavy wool blankets, only the crown of her head visible. "How long since you went down to a town?" Martha asked, her tone conversational, devoid of pity. Caleb stopped whittling. He stared at the flames licking the blackened bricks. 7 years. Next spring makes 8. Provisions. I trade pelts with a trapper who comes up the lower pass every October. He brings coffee, salt powder, lead, takes the furs. Martha tied off a knot, bit the heavy thread with her teeth, and tossed the repaired coat onto a chair. She picked up a pair of denim trousers. "You don't like people. People don't like looking at a monster," Caleb stated flatly. He reached up, his rough fingers tracing the jagged, uneven ridge of scar tissue that ran from his temple down to his jaw. "Children cry, men reach for their guns. Women look at me like I'm a rotting carcass in the road. It's easier up here. Trees don't stare." Martha paused. She looked at him, resting her hands on the denim in her lap. The lantern light caught the exhaustion in her face, deepening the bags under her dark eyes. "My husband, Thomas," she began, her voice low and steady. "He was a good man, but he had a weak heart and a terrible mind for numbers. When he died, he left me with a mountain of debt to the supply company. They took the house, they took the smithy, they took the anvil." She looked down at her thick hands, flexing her fingers. "I tried to get work scrubbing floors, washing laundry, but folks in St. Louis, they like their servants small and invisible. I'm neither. I take up space. I eat too much. They said I make the floorboards groan. I sweat. They look at me at this body, and they didn't see a woman trying to feed her child. They saw a joke, a nuisance, a hog taking up too much of their clean air." She looked back up at Caleb, her gaze piercing right through the gloom. "They didn't fear me like they fear you. They just wished I didn't exist. So I bought a ruined wagon and a half, dead mule with the last of my silver, and I left. Figured out west the dirt wouldn't care how much I weighed." Caleb sat perfectly still. The wind hammered the roof, but inside the cabin the silence felt dense, thick with something he couldn't name. He had spent 7 years believing his pain was uniquely his own, written in blood across his face. He looked at Martha, at her wide hips, her thick neck, her plain exhausted face. She wore her hardship in the sheer mass of her flesh, in the heavy, unyielding reality of a body the world found unacceptable. "So we're both monsters, then," Caleb rasped. Martha gave a short, humorless bark of a laugh. She picked up the needle again. "Speak for yourself, mountain man. I'm just fat, and you're just ugly. Only monsters I know wear fine suits and collect debts from widows." She drove the needle through the denim. A snick. Pull. Caleb looked down at the piece of pine in his hand. He realized he had carved a rough, blocky shape of a mule. He tossed it into the fire and watched it burn. The tightness in his chest had loosened, replaced by a strange quiet hum. He stood up, walked over to the small iron stove, and poured a cup of water from the warming kettle. He set it on the table near her elbow, right next to the lantern. Martha didn't stop sewing, but she glanced at the cup. "Thank you. Your hands are cramping," Caleb noted, looking at how tightly she gripped the fabric. "They'll survive." Caleb walked over to the small frosted window. He scratched away the ice on the inside of the glass with his thumbnail and peered out into the blackness. The snow was coming down in thick, blinding sheets. It was already drifting halfway up the woodshed door. The lower pass would be entirely blocked by morning. It wouldn't thaw for a week, maybe 2. "Wagons fixed," Caleb said quietly, his breath fogging the cold glass. Martha paused her stitching. The snick of the needle stopped. "I know. Pass is blocked." He continued, turning around to face her. "Snow's drifting deep. You try to take that wagon out tomorrow. The mud will freeze around the wheels. The mule will freeze in the traces." Martha looked at him, her dark eyes unreadable in the lantern light. "You saying we're stuck here?" "I'm saying you're not leaving tomorrow." Martha stared at him for a long moment. She looked at his scarred face, the harsh line of his jaw, the one good eye that met hers without flinching. She let out a heavy breath, the tension bleeding out of her wide shoulders. "Good," she said simply. She picked up the pants. "Because these hems are a disaster, and it's going to take me at least 3 days to fix what you've done to them." Caleb didn't smile. His face didn't know how to do that anymore. But as he sat back down on his pallet and pulled his blanket up, he listened to the heavy, steady rhythm of her breathing, the sharp pull of the thread, and the howling storm outside. For the first time in his memory, the cabin didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a fort. 5 days of howling white, the wind didn't just blow. It battered the log walls like a physical weight, shrieking down the stone chimney to spit gray ash across the floorboards. Inside the air grew dense, tasting of boiled pinto beans, wet wool, and the sharp metallic tang of the cast iron stove running red hot against the freeze. Caleb felt cornered in his own home. He was a man who needed the horizon, a man who measured his comfort by the miles of empty timber between him and the next heartbeat. Now his entire world was a 12 box dominated by a woman who refused to make herself small. Martha took up space. She walked with heavy, deliberate thuds, her thick hips brushing against the rough-hewn table, her broad shoulders claiming the entire right side of the hearth. She had commandeered his kitchen by day 2, scrubbing his pots until the old rancid grease was gone, reorganizing his meager pantry of dried goods with ruthless, unapologetic efficiency. She didn't ask permission. She just acted, driven by the practical necessity of keeping 3 bodies fueled and warm. It grated on Caleb's nerves. He found himself sitting in the darkest corner of the cabin, his long legs drawn up, whittling aggressively just to have an excuse not to look at her. But he couldn't ignore her. The sheer gravity of her presence demanded attention. Every time she reached for the coffee tin, the floor creaked. Every time she laughed at something Lily said, the sound filled the room, a rich, dark baritone that vibrated in Caleb's chest. "You're making a mess," Martha observed on the 6th afternoon. Caleb paused his knife. A pile of pine shavings sat between his boots. He looked up, his one good eye narrowing. She was standing over him, holding a ragged straw broom she had salvaged from his woodshed. Sweat shone in the deep crease of her neck. "It's my floor," he grunted, dragging the blade down the wood. "And it's my broom," she shot back, not missing a beat. "Lift your boots." "I'm not living in a barn just because you forgot what a dustpan looks like." He wanted to tell her to go to hell. He wanted to remind her that she was a stranded guest eating his rations. But he looked at the set of her jaw, the stubborn fold of her arms across her massive chest, and he knew it was a losing battle. With a harsh exhale that blew ash from his mustache, he lifted his boots. Martha swept the shavings away with hard, efficient strokes. "You brewed too much," she muttered, bending down with a heavy grunt to scoop the pile into a tin pan. "Sitting in the dark won't make the snow melt any faster. Just makes you miserable company. I didn't ask for company. You didn't ask for a blizzard either, but here we are." She dumped the shavings into the fire. The flames crackled, eating the dry pine instantly. She turned back to him, wiping her brow with a flour dusted for him. "Lily's driving me mad. She needs something to do besides terrorize my last nerve. Teach her how to tie those knots you're always fiddling with." Caleb stiffened. He looked over at the cot. Lily was hanging upside down off the edge, her mousy hair sweeping the floor, her face flushed red. She was blowing bubbles with her spit. "I don't know anything about kids," Caleb said flatly. His voice felt tight. The truth was kids usually ran from him. When he walked through logging camps years ago, mothers used to pull their toddlers behind their skirts, whispering about the monster who lived up the ridge. "She's not a complicated machine, Caleb." Martha sighed, using his name for the first time. It sounded strange coming from her mouth, heavy and solid. "She's just bored. Show her the ropes." Martha turned her back, walking to the table to punch down a mound of sourdough. The matter was settled in her mind. Caleb sat rigid for a long minute. Then he reached into his canvas sack and pulled out a length of braided hemp rope. He tossed it onto the floorboards in front of his boots. "Kid," he rasped. Lily stopped blowing bubbles. She sat up, peering at him through a mess of hair. "Come here." She slid off the cot and marched over, her scuffed boots loud in the quiet cabin. She didn't hesitate or linger nervously at the edge of his space. She plunked herself down directly on the floor in front of him, crossing her skinny legs. She looked at the rope, then up at his face. Her gaze tracked the jagged white line that cut through his eyebrow and disappeared into his beard. "My mama says it's rude to stare," Lily announced brightly. "But she also says ignoring facts makes you stupid. Your face is a fact. Caleb felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. He didn't know whether to yell at her or laugh. He settled for picking up the rope. You talk too much. I know. Teach me the thing. He held up the hemp. Bowline knot. It holds weight. Won't slip even if you put a dead ox on the other end. He formed a loop with his large scarred hands, moving slowly. Rabbit comes out of the hole, goes around the tree, goes back down the hole. Watch. Lily leaned in close, her small brow furrowed in intense concentration. She smelled of dried oats and dust. She snatched the rope from his hands the second he finished the demonstration. Her tiny fingers fumbled awkwardly with the thick, scratchy hemp. She twisted it the wrong way, creating a useless tangle. Wrong, Caleb grunted. He reached out to take it back, but she yanked it away. I can do it. Don't touch. She snapped, her face scrunching up in a fierce imitation of her mother's stubbornness. Caleb pulled his hand back, surprised. He watched her struggle, her tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth. After 3 failed attempts, she threw the rope on the floor with a frustrated sigh. It's stupid. No, Caleb said softly, his deep voice dropping a register. You're just impatient. Iron doesn't forge on the first strike. Rope doesn't tie itself. Try again. He didn't do it for her. He sat there for an hour watching her fail, correct herself, and try again. And for that hour, he completely forgot about the blinding white storm hammering against his windows. He forgot about the ruined meat of his cheek. He just watched a skinny little girl wrestle with a piece of hemp, while the heavy, rhythmic thud of Martha kneading dough filled the background. It was the most normal afternoon he had experienced in 7 years. It terrified him. Morning broke with an eerie, deafening silence. The constant shrieking roar of the wind had finally died. Caleb kicked the heavy wooden door open, using his shoulder to break the ice seal. A solid wall of packed white snow greeted him, drifted 4 feet high against the porch. The sky above was a painful, brilliant blue, completely empty of clouds. The temperature had plummeted overnight to a brittle, lung-scorching cold. He grabbed his flat iron shovel and began hacking at the drift, throwing heavy blocks of frozen snow over the porch railing. He needed to get to the woodshed, and he needed to check the roof. The log joints were groaning ominously, complaining about the massive weight of the snowpack sitting above them. 10 minutes into his labor, the cabin door creaked open behind him. Martha stepped out. She was wrapped in 2 of his spare wool blankets over her dress, tied off at her thick waist with a piece of rope. A woolen scarf was wrapped around her head, leaving only her dark, tired eyes and red, chapped nose exposed. Get back inside, Caleb ordered, not breaking his rhythm. His breath plumed in thick white clouds. It's 10 below zero. The roof sounds like a dying ship, Martha retorted, grabbing a wooden grain scoop from its hook on the porch wall. You get up there and clear the peak. I'll shovel the runoff away from the walls. If it melts and freezes against the base logs, the rot will set in by spring. Caleb stopped and leaned on his shovel handle. He looked at her massive frame. You'll break your neck in this ice. Martha leveled a flat, deadpan stare at him. Caleb, I am built like a brick oven. If I fall, I'll just dent the earth. Now find the ladder. Arguing with her was like trying to argue with a landslide. Caleb dug out the crude wooden ladder buried beside the shed and propped it against the lowest eaves. The climb was treacherous, his boots slipping on the rungs. Once on the roof, the scale of the problem became apparent. The snow was easily 3 feet deep, packed heavy and dense from the wind. He started shoveling, throwing the white chunks over the edge. Down below, Martha went to work. She wasn't fast, but she was relentless. She drove the wooden scoop into the snowbanks with her thick, powerful legs, leveraging her considerable weight to move mountains of white away from the cabin foundation. She grunted with every heave, a harsh, rhythmic sound that drifted up to Caleb in the still, freezing air. They worked in silence for 2 hours. The sun rose higher, blindingly bright off the snow, but offering no real heat. Sweat began to freeze on Caleb's beard. His shoulders burned, the old muscles tearing in protest. Watch out below, Caleb warned, sliding a massive slab of packed snow off the tin flashing near the chimney. It plummeted over the edge, crashing onto the ground, right where Martha was standing. She had stepped back, but the ground beneath her boots was pure slick ice, hidden by a thin layer of powder. As she tried to pivot away from the falling debris, her heavy right boot lost purchase. Her arms flew out in a desperate bid for balance. A sharp, ugly gasp tore from her throat as her feet went out from under her. 250 pounds of solid flesh and bone hit the frozen ground with a sickening heavy thud that Caleb felt in his own teeth. Martha. Caleb dropped his shovel. He didn't bother with the ladder. He slid off the low edge of the roof, dropping 10 feet into the deep drift below. He scrambled out of the snowbank, his heart hammering against his ribs in sudden cold panic. She was lying on her back, staring up at the blue sky, her chest heaving in short, jagged gaps. The wind had been knocked completely out of her. Caleb fell to his knees beside her in the snow. "Where does it hurt?" he demanded, his voice cracking. He reached out, his large hands hovering awkwardly over her thick shoulders, terrified to touch her and cause more pain. Did you snap your neck?" Martha closed her eyes, fighting for breath. Her face was gray under the biting cold. "I'm fine," she wheezed out, her voice barely a whisper. "Just give me a minute. Don't move," Caleb ordered, his hands trembling slightly. "If your back is broken—" "It's not broken," she rasped, finally drawing in a deep, agonizing pull of air. She opened her dark eyes and glared at him. "I just landed on my pride and my tailbone. Both are screaming." She rolled slowly onto her side, wincing, her massive face contorting in pain. She planted a thick mittened hand in the snow and tried to push herself up, but her arm trembled and gave out. She collapsed back with a frustrated grunt. "Damn it." "Stop fighting it," Caleb snapped, stripping off his heavy leather gloves. He moved closer, invading her space. He slid his thick, scarred right arm under her wide back, right beneath her shoulder blades. He slid his other arm under her thick thighs. Martha's eyes widened. "What are you doing? You can't lift me. You'll blow out your back."
Shut up!
Caleb gritted out. He didn't think about it. He just locked his jaw, planted his boots deep into the snow, and used every ounce of raw, brutal strength he had cultivated over 7 years of hauling logs and dead elk. He strained, the muscles in his neck cording, a deep growl tearing from his throat. He hauled her up against his chest. She was incredibly, profoundly heavy, a solid, dense weight that threatened to pull him right back down into the ice. But he held her. She gasped, instinctively wrapping her thick arms around his thick neck, her face buried against the rough, cold canvas of his coat. She smelled of sweat, freezing air, and something uniquely, undeniably human. Caleb carried her toward the porch, his knees popping with every slow, deliberate step. He didn't look at her face. He kept his eyes locked on the door. But he felt the heat of her pressing through their layers of clothes. He felt the rapid, terrified thumping of her heart against his rib cage. He kicked the door open and carried her inside, carefully lowering her onto his own bed near the hearth. He backed away immediately, his chest heaving, his left shoulder burning with a vicious agony. Martha sat on the edge of the mattress, clutching her lower back. Her breathing ragged. She looked at him. She didn't look embarrassed. She looked at him with an intensity that made him want to retreat to the woodshed. "You lifted me," she said, her voice stripped of its usual gruff armor. It was a statement of sheer disbelief. Caleb turned away, tossing his hat onto the table. He grabbed a rag to wipe the melting snow from his beard, hiding his scared face in the rough cloth. "Told you to stay inside. Men don't lift me, Caleb," she said quietly. "They complain about the space I take up on a bench. They don't carry me." Caleb threw the rag down. He looked at her. She was battered, exhausted, and taking up his entire bed. She was the most stubborn, infuriating woman he had ever met. "You're not a nuisance, Martha." Caleb found himself saying the words rough and unpracticed, torn from some deeply buried place in his gut. "You're just solid. Nothing wrong with solid." He turned and walked back out into the freezing cold to finish the roof, leaving the heavy, unspoken weight of his words hanging in the warm cabin air. Water dripped from the eaves in a maddening, relentless rhythm. Plink, plink, plink. The deep freeze had broken, surrendering to a slow, ugly thaw that turned the mountain into a dripping gray sponge. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the harsh smell of boiling willow bark and fever sweat. Martha hadn't left Caleb's bed in 3 days. The fall hadn't just bruised her tailbone. The violent impact and the bone, deep cold of the snow, had settled in her chest. It started as a dry rattle and blossomed into a wet, heavy cough that shook her massive frame and left her gray-faced and gasping. Caleb sat on a stool beside the bed, a steaming tin cup in his hand. He hadn't slept for more than an hour at a time. His beard was welder than usual, his good eye bloodshot and lined with deep, dark exhaustion. "Drink." He ordered, his voice a gravelly rasp. Martha turned her head away. Her mousy hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat. The thick, capable arms that had pumped the blacksmith's bellows now lay slack over the wool blanket. Tastes like dirty river water, she wheezed. It's willow bark and mint. It'll break the fever. Drink. You're a terrible nurse, she muttered, though she let him slide his thick arm under her neck to lift her head. Her weight was heavy, deadened by the sickness. Caleb held her steady, feeling the ferocious heat radiating off her skin. He brought the rim of the tin cup to her chapped lips. She swallowed blindly, grimacing as the bitter liquid went down. A violent, coughing fit seized her immediately. Caleb didn't pull away. He braced her back, his large hand spreading wide across her shoulder blades, holding her together while the spasm tore through her lungs. When it finally passed, she fell back against his arm, completely drained. Her dark eyes fluttered open, finding his face. The firelight flickered across his ruined cheek, casting deep, grotesque shadows over the jagged scar tissue. You're staring, Caleb said quietly, preparing to lower her back to the pillow. I'm looking, Martha corrected him, her voice weak but stubborn. She didn't look away. Slowly, with her trembling hand, she reached up. Her thick, callous thumb grazed the edge of the scar where it met his jawline. Caleb froze, every muscle in his massive body locked. For 7 years, the only thing that had touched that side of his face was the freezing wind and his own razor. Her touch was hot and uncomfortably real. He expected disgust. He expected a flinch. She just rested her thumb there, feeling the hard, unnatural ridge of the cauterized skin. Doesn't make you a monster, Caleb, she whispered, her chest rattling with every word. It just proves you're harder to kill than most things. Caleb's breath hitched in his throat. He swallowed hard, gently lowering her head back down onto the mattress. He pulled the blanket up under her chin, his hands clumsy and awkward. Rest. The thaw has melted in the few drifts. The mud will be passable in a few days. Martha closed her eyes. Good. I'm tired of your cooking. Across the room, Lily sat on the floor, quietly weaving a massive tangled web out of the hemp rope Caleb had given her. She looked up. You shouldn't leave, Mama. Mr. Caleb needs someone to tell him when he's being stupid. He doesn't know how to sweep. Caleb retreated to the hearth, picking up the iron poker to stir the dying coals. He stared into the embers, the ghost of Martha's touch burning a hole straight through his jaw. By the 5th day of the thaw, the fever broke. The heavy, oppressive sickness lifted, leaving Martha weak, pale, but undeniably herself. She insisted on getting out of bed, leaning heavily on Caleb's kitchen table as she forced her thick legs to bear her weight again. Caleb watched her from the doorway of the shed. The snowpack was completely gone, replaced by a sea of thick, sucking alkaline mud. Down by the creek the wagon sat ready, the heavy iron sleeve Caleb had forged gleaming dull and gray in the weak spring sunlight. Barnaby the mule was grazing on patches of exposed dead grass, his coat shaggy and shedding. It was time. Morning came with the smell of wet earth and pine needles. The sky was the pale washed-out blue of early spring. Martha moved methodically, carrying her few belongings out to the wagon. She moved stiffly, favoring her bruised back, her breath coming a little shorter than usual. Caleb carried the heavy sacks, the salted pork, the flour, the repaired canvas tent. He loaded them into the back of the wagon, his movements sharp and violently efficient. Neither of them had spoken more than 10 words since breakfast. Caleb walked back into the cabin. It was immaculate. His mended clothes were folded in neat, tight squares on his cot. The cast iron Dutch oven was oiled and sitting perfectly center on the stove. The floorboards were swept bare. The heavy, comforting scent of lye soap and dried apples lingered in the corners, fighting against the old smell of tallow and smoke. It was his sanctuary again, and he hated it. He walked outside. Martha was buckling Barnaby into the leather traces. She patted the mule's thick neck, murmuring something low and rough that made the animal pin its ears back in a half. Hearted threat. Lily ran up to Caleb. She didn't hug him. She stopped 2 feet away, thrusting a small, grubby hand into her pocket. She pulled out a small jagged piece of white quartz. I found this under the snow, she said, holding it out. It's shiny. You can keep it so you don't forget how to tie the rabbit knot. Caleb looked at the rock. He slowly reached out with his scarred, frostbitten hand and took it. It was cold and sharp. I won't forget, kid. Lily nodded. Satisfied, she climbed up onto the wooden bench of the wagon, kicking her small boots against the floorboards. Martha turned around. She wiped her hands on her skirt. She looked at Caleb, taking in his massive hulking frame, the defensive slope of his shoulders, the terrible awe-inspiring ruin of his face. She didn't offer her hand. "The axle will hold," Martha said, her voice dropping into its familiar gruff baritone. "Aaron's thick," Caleb replied. "Keep the mule at a slow walk through the switchbacks. The mud is deep. You'll slip if you push him." "I know how to drive a wagon." "I know you do." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. The mountain wind rustled the bare branches of the aspens. Caleb wanted to speak. He wanted to tell her that the cabin was too quiet. He wanted to tell her that for the first time in 7 years. He hadn't thought about putting a bullet in his own brain just to stop the silence. But the words were trapped behind a wall of pride and deep cynical fear. She was a woman heading for a new life. He was a scarred hermit living on a rock. "Thank you, Caleb," Martha said finally, "for the iron and for the roof." She turned, grabbing the wooden handhold, and hauled her massive frame up onto the wagon bench beside her daughter. The suspension groaned under her weight. She picked up the leather reins. "Hey!" she barked, slapping the leathers over Barnaby's rump. The mule snorted, leaning into the harness. The wagon lurched forward, the iron-sleeved axle holding firm, the wooden wheels carving deep, wet trenches into the mud. Caleb stood in the clearing, watching them go. The wagon lumbered down the slope, slipping slightly in the muck before catching its balance. He watched until the gray canvas top disappeared behind a thick stand of evergreens. The sound of the creaking wood and the rattling trace chains faded into the roar of the swollen creek. He was entirely alone. Caleb walked back into the cabin. He shut the door. The latch clicked, echoing sharply in the empty room. He stood in the center of the floorboards. The silence roared in his ears. It didn't feel like peace anymore. It felt like a grave. He looked at the neatly folded shirts on his cot. He looked at the floor where Lily had sat wrestling with the hemp rope. He reached into his pocket and felt the sharp edge of the quartz rock. "My mama can fix that." Caleb let out a harsh, ragged breath. He walked to the corner and grabbed his heavy canvas coat. He shrugged it on, the mended seams stretching comfortably over his broad shoulders, not too tight, breathing exactly like she said they should. He grabbed his Winchester. He didn't run. He wasn't a young fool chasing a stagecoach in a dime novel. He was a 35-year-old man with a bad knee and a ruined face. He walked out to the corral. He threw a saddle over his own riding mule, a mean, raw-boned beast named Rust. He strapped his bedroll to the cantle and jammed the rifle into the scabbard. The mud on the trail was thick and treacherous, but the wagon ruts were impossible to miss. Caleb rode, slowly letting the mule pick its way down the steep switchbacks. It took him 2 hours to reach the lower valley floor. The wagon was stopped near a shallow river crossing. Barnaby was drinking aggressively from the icy water. Martha was standing beside the left front wheel, frowning down at a clump of muddy grass wrapped around the wooden spokes. She heard the hoofbeats and turned. Caleb pulled Rust to a halt 10 yards away. The mule snorted, shaking its head. Caleb sat in the saddle, his coat smelling of wet horse and pine. He looked at her. Martha crossed her thick arms over her chest, leaning her weight against the side of the wagon. She didn't look surprised. Her dark eyes gleamed with a faint, cynical humor. "Forget to charge me for the coffee beans." Caleb rested his forearms on the saddle horn. "River's running high past the canyon. You try to ford it alone, you'll drown that mule and flip the wagon. I've forded rivers before." She fired back, her chin lifting defensively. "Not this one." Caleb swung his heavy frame down from the saddle. His boots hit the mud with a solid thud. He walked toward her, closing the distance until he was standing just an arm's length away. He looked up at the wagon bench. Lily was hanging over the edge, grinning toothily. He looked back down at Martha. "You need someone to ride ahead and find the shallow gravel beds. I need someone who knows how to sew a damn hem." Martha stared at him. The wind whipped a stray lock of mousy hair across her face. She studied the harsh, unyielding lines of his scarred cheek, the stubborn set of his shoulders. She saw exactly what he was offering. No romance, no flowery promises, just brutal, honest partnership in a world that had thrown them both away. A slow, genuine smile broke across her wide, exhausted face, transforming it completely. "You eat too much meat, Caleb. We'll need to stop in the next town and buy beans." Caleb felt a strange, tight-pulling sensation in his face. It hurt, an unfamiliar stretching of long dead muscles and scar tissue. It was ugly. It was crooked. But it was there. I know a place. Caleb grunted, stepping up to take Barnaby's bridle and lead them into the water.